Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? This week, we have a real treat for you. It's been a while since we've had an interview episode, and I'm excited to get back to the format with a great guest. Michael Johns is a conservative commentator and writer. He was a speechwriter in the George H.W. Bush administration and a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. He was also part of the leadership of the Tea Party and served as a spokesman for that groundbreaking movement. Johns wrote the U.S. and Africa Statistical Handbook and was a contributor to Finding Our Roots, Facing Our Future, America's 21st Century and Freedom in the World, the annual guide of political rights and civil liberties. Michael Johns is on the phone now. Michael, welcome to the Political Spirits Podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So my first question might be the obvious one, but anyone who heard that introduction knows that your background in the Republican Party and in support of the Republican Party goes way back. So
right.
My first question is, what are the changes you've seen in the party since your days going back to George H.W. Bush and the Heritage Foundation?
Well, the party has evolved considerably, and it's needed to evolve because the challenges and issues that we've confronted themselves have evolved. So I think, when you look, say, back to the Reagan administration and take the issues that we were confronting then, what were they? They were primarily Reagan comes in January of 1981 following the Iran hostage crisis. Communism had been on the move. The Soviet Union had been on the move globally in the 4 years of Carter's administration. They'd invaded Afghanistan. Nicaragua had fallen. Iran had fallen into the hands of a hostile power. And then at home, we had this stagflation, a term we haven't even really utilized since Carter administration, but might be utilizing again soon. And that was both double-digit unemployment and double-digit inflation. And so the country was failing in all respects. And Reagan comes in with a bold agenda, embracing a free market supply-side economic agenda, embracing American strength abroad, rebuilding American defenses, and the Reagan doctrine of support for freedom fighters resisting Soviet-backed regimes around the world. So that agenda, pretty broadly embraced by the American people, proved successful. But simultaneously, when you go through the 80s, 90s, into the 21st century, we realize sort of now in retrospect, there are these fundamental issues we weren't addressing. One was China's ascendance, their completely unfair and illegal trade practices, including intellectual property theft, and their enormous human rights crises at home, and now labeled a genocidal regime, in fact, by the United States. The threat they're presenting to us in geopolitical leadership and in really leadership in the world. And the immigration crisis, the issue of securing our southern border had received some attention in the 20th century, but we never really did much about it. The number of illegal immigrants in the United States grew exponentially. There's not even really a solid figure on what that number is today. Could be as many as 30 million, but it's clearly growing now by an enormous rate. And that represents a great danger. So, when Trump comes in 2016 or emerges in 2016, the appeal of his candidacy and the reason I embraced him from day one was, number one, this idea that Washington probably has reached the point where it's not capable of curing itself, that we needed external leadership to do that. And then number Two, that we had this broad range of issues in immigration in China and in generally unfair and unhelpful trade relationships with some of our major trading partners that required urgent attention. And that gave birth really to sort of a more populist, or what's been labeled a populist edge to the Republican Party. So that's been really the primary change. It's been an important one because these three issues of trade, China, and immigration have really required our urgent attention. In fact, we should have been on these issues in a much earlier way than we have been.
I really agree with you 100% on especially on that part of it. My next question was going to be, and you've already answered it, do you think the Republican Party took too long to really aggressively address those issues? And I think what you're saying is, yes, they did. And in my view, Trump was the prime mover to basically get the Republican Party up off its butt to step up on those issues. And part of the message of his presidency, whether he ends up back in the presidency or whether he steps back and, has more periodic input as opposed to actually running, is that the public on the right expects an aggressive fighter. Whether they like everything about that fighter is another question, but they want the party and its spokespeople to aggressively push back and fight on these issues. And I don't think that much of the Republican Party was doing that pre-Trump. And some of the Republican Party was completely conflicted on it. Issues of illegal immigration, for example. You've got the Democrats who are wanting to import Democrat voters, and previously large numbers of Republicans that were, supportive of an underpaid working class that would come across the border illegally and hold the wages down to the benefit of corporations. That has been an issue in the past, and with some Republicans, I frankly think it still is.
Yep.
Do you agree on that?
I absolutely agree. This has not been, it's maybe even a mistake to label it an oversight, because I think at high levels there's been no doubt about what's been going on, and this is a bipartisan or cross-partisan crises. We're really confronting what has been a strategic plan, a global plan that is consciously designed to hold back and even eradicate the middle class of this country. That's why this immigration has been so illogical and thoughtless. It's a complete supply and demand dynamic, increased labor pool without increasing the jobs. We're simultaneously outsourcing our jobs and allowing them to be eradicated through trade relationships with countries like China that are manipulating their currency, that are subsidizing their industry, that are engaged in dumping practices, that are stealing our intellectual property. It's tough to call that free trade, and yet that's what we've called it in defense of allowing it to continue. And the result, as you drive around this country, is hollowed out areas of the Rust Belt, famously, but not even just the Rust Belt. I mean, it's a complete national problem where we've lost these industries and they're not coming back in a lot of cases. And it's not a reasonable or adequate response to say that that's just move these people into new industries or allow that or retrain them. It's not a practical reality. In many cases, and it's particularly true of blue collar workers in this country, they've been attached to industries that have, some of them had really good wages and were difficult to learn. They really required high-end manufacturing, basically. And I think that's a key to our country's future still. I think we can't surrender high-end manufacturing to Asia and expect to be a global economic power. We've got to recognize the critical importance of that to our country. And so people may say, well, look, if Trump put these tariffs in, that's not free trade. That's true. It's not free trade, but it's designed to bring about free trade. It's a lever designed to, force our trading partners to revise their practices. I don't know why it's proven so complicating to them to grasp, and it's simply like, say Reagan deploying MX missiles to Europe during the Cold War. He wasn't deploying missiles because he wanted to use those missiles. He was using those missiles because he wanted to utilize them to bring about an end to provocative expansionist Cold War practices. And I realize that that's, an inverse logic, but it actually worked and works, and it would work and will work now. And what Biden's doing is not going to work. Biden is surrendering to this paradigm, and which is really one of what's called managed decline. It's an actual phrase. It's utilized among economists and governing elite around the world, and it's based on an understanding that they know full well what they're doing, that we're consciously managing the decline of America's leadership. And so the question every American needs to understand is, are you okay with that? If you're okay with that, the Biden school and all the people he surrounded himself with represent that very well, and are implementing it. And if your position is hold it, we haven't had any national referendum on that, and I certainly don't support that. Then we got to move in a different direction. And largely, I would say on an idea basis, what Trump had presented and what Trump was doing was pretty much 100% on target.
I agree.
What, to the extent it fell short, it was in operational implementation, and the fact that no one man can do this. It takes a complete, almost restructuring of government around that. So while he had some very valuable aides and guidance, I'd cite somebody like Peter Navarro, somebody I think was bringing a lot of brain power to these issues and explaining them properly to the president. For every Peter Navarro, there were 3 or 4 people that were still of the old school. That makes it difficult to actually get a lot of these things implemented, especially when you've got Congress more or less not aligned with it, media completely hostile to it, and a general political culture that's not inclined to embrace it.
As well as untold numbers of entrenched bureaucrats whose daily goal was to obstruct the changes, because many of the changes were designed to either put them out of a job or reduce the number of entrenched bureaucrats that they had. I mean, things like, for example, President Trump was moving the Agriculture Department, the Department of Interior, the back office support people, he was moving them into the interior of the country, into places where there actually is farming. He was moving them to Missouri for agriculture and Colorado for interior, which is largely involved with mining and federal lands, which is,
right.
Much more germane to those states than it is to the District of Columbia. So he was making changes, and the entrenched bureaucrats were fighting him every step of the way. And I think that for all of the horrible, frustrating aspects of the 2 impeachments, what they showed to the public, large numbers of the public, was the extent to which entrenched bureaucrats are there to undermine the will of the electorate. I mean, you had people in the initial impeachment who were upset about the fact that they had made recommendations in their sort of group meetings, and President Trump wasn't implementing them. He wanted to go.
That's right. That's so well put.
Nobody elected you. I was stunned.
Yeah, I've worded it exactly that way, and few did. But when you look at the Russia impeachment, with the Russia investigation, and then you look at the Ukraine impeachment, both of them were a product of bureaucrats who felt almost insulted that Trump was involved in their policy areas. And particularly true in the Ukraine issue. I mean, you saw that the congressional testimony on that impeachment effort, and you listen to what they're saying, there was no content to it really, except for the fact that these guys had developed a sort of sense of monopolistic control over these issue areas and didn't like, an outside, non-politician of non-Beltway origin engaged in them. On Ukraine, obviously, just quite clear. I mean, you take that call, there was no offer of any reciprocal relationship.
Right.
President of Ukraine acknowledged that. We released the aid that was in question. That never was held back. And we never got anything for it. So it was completely baseless. Yet the substantive commentary you could hear was really one of, no, hold it. This is Trump involving himself in Ukraine policy. And of course, the allegations on the collusion were completely contrived, and just an absolute disservice to this country. Incredible to me, really, that we're not dealing with greater accountability, honestly. And we'll see what John Durham produces out of the Department of Justice. But boy, the clock's been ticking on that whole thing. He's now been in there over 2 years, and I think we're really owed a greater sense of what the official assessment was of illegal wrongdoing prior to the election, not after the election.
Yeah, absolutely. We're owed that. I'm very skeptical that we'll get it. I mean, if there's one thing that the over-the-top developments of the last couple of years have shown, it's that there really seems to be two systems of accountability in this country, one for ordinary citizens and another one for government bureaucrats. And
right.
and the conduct of those bureaucrats involved in the impeachment, where they seem so upset that the elected official didn't follow their advice, how dare he? We saw that in the COVID response as well. And I don't think enough people are making this connection. As you look not just in Washington, but all around the country, the supposed experts coming up with all sorts of rules and regulations, scattershot, attacking individual freedoms. And then it turns out that much of what they've done was either counterproductive or had no effect at all. You go from the lunacy of what happened in New York State to Governor, as I like to call her, Obergruppenführer Whitmer in Michigan, with what I constantly reference, which is the prohibition on operating a boat with a motor, but you're okay to operate one with a paddle, as if somehow the transmissibility of COVID is affected by whether you're running a bass boat or...
And she was okay using her own boat in the middle of all of these prohibitive measures, importantly, showing the complete hypocrisy under which most of these restrictive Democrat governors have operated. They've imposed all these restrictions, and yet they've had no problem going out dining. They've had no problem going out boating. And
her husband tried to cut the line on getting his boat ready out of winter storage.
Right.
He tried to cut the line based on who he was, and then the marina operator went public, which was great. But you look at the experts, and these arbitrary times where restaurants and bars have to shut down as if somehow COVID's more transmissible after 10 o'clock. It made no sense. And these are purportedly the experts heading these health agencies that are adopting these rules, and they're not really using their expertise. They're just exercising their power. And it's common across the board.
And no better example, in my view, on that than Dr. Anthony Fauci, who has been, just simply wrong on just about every major issue throughout this pandemic.
Yep.
He was wrong early on, and if you go back and look at his early 60 Minutes interview, where completely contradicting himself, he said masks were ineffective. He might have been right on that. But was advising people not to utilize them. Also, importantly, said that the pandemic was really of no substantial risk to the American people. I mean, that basically completely downplaying this. Then wrong on therapeutics, wrong in his resisting the hugely important travel ban that President Trump put in place on January 30. Against China. I mean, just the most logical step that you would take in a case like this is stop the bleeding, which is meaning stop individuals from the host country of this communicable disease from actually entering the United States. He resisted that, said travel bans don't work. That's documented. Peter Navarro attested to the one-on-one meetings in which he made those arguments. Maybe most importantly and most currently, never revealed to anyone in the Trump administration that his gain of function research that he had been funding at the Wuhan virology lab to the tune of millions of dollars actually had been properly halted by the Obama National Security Council. And in 2017, the Trump administration comes in and he somehow sneaks into the White House, deals with a yet to be named lower level official in a science office in the White House, and pressures them essentially to reauthorize the allocation of the money that was funding this hugely dangerous research from which this pandemic stems, in my judgment. All right. Yeah. That's not, I guess we're starting to put the pieces together that's where it's come from. I don't know why it's taken this long to really do that. This idea that somehow it would have been a product of, the wet lab that was already discounted, and the idea that you would bring up these, bats from the Laotian and Vietnamese border, which is hundreds of miles away from Wuhan, and they would infect no one throughout that whole essentially 20-hour drive, and then just conveniently emerge right there in the city where this highest security level 4 lab, the only one in Asia, is conducting this dangerous gain of function research. It's just baffles common sense. It defies common sense.
Well, the one positive is I think there is starting to be a common understanding and belief that it really was an escape from the laboratory, that we're not dealing the whole idea of a something arising out of the wet market. That's sort of fallen by the wayside, at least in the U.S. in discussion. The question is whether anybody in the Democrat Party cares. And I'm not so sure they do. I think they want to keep it covered up. Unless it's something they can blame on Trump, I don't think they care. In the end, they may sacrifice Fauci. I wouldn't be shocked to see him canned. And frankly, I think he deserves it. I think this requires more investigation. But if you look at his statements on the issues, they flip-flop back and forth on a nearly daily basis.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. And literally every single thing, and sometimes in the very same interview. I mean, you'll just hear two completely different arguments on it. That's what, that I'm a little more forgiving on, because I think, he's not accustomed to a high-profile role that he's been thrust into. What I'm not okay with is all of the conflicting pressures that I think he's been placed under, and particularly his relationship with China's Communist Party, which he just seems to minimize, takes them at their word. This is a regime that has killed tens of millions of people over the years, that is now officially a genocidal regime, labeled such by the United States, and is got its fingerprints all over this pandemic. I mean, from the origins of it to the release of it to actually expediting its transmission globally, and particularly in the United States. And the idea that was done consciously can't be, that needs to be looked at seriously as well. I mean, who has been the ultimate beneficiary of this? There haven't been many. We've lost 500,000 people and had over a year's GDP in economic cost. I mean, it's like $16 to $20 trillion now we're looking at. The global economy's been decimated, but China's manipulated it in ways that have been beneficial, and clearly getting rid of Trump was essential. And you never would have had, look, I mean, two issues we can't move forward on, in my view, until we resolve is, number one, November 3, there continue to be major issues in 6 states in this country that have not been sufficiently investigated. That needs to be done. We need forensic audits in those 6 states. And the American people need to be assured that we either have the right president who actually did receive over 270 electoral college votes in the Oval Office now, or we need to take the measures necessary for corrective steps. You simply can't allow those doubts to remain. And the doubts are too compelling. I mean, half the country is disbelieving of this election. And the second thing is China's accountability on COVID. This did not drop from the sky. It was a product of human engagement and human manipulation, and all of that is China's Communist Party. So this is not an issue of all of China. This is not an issue of the people of China. It's an issue of this particular political party that has an extraordinary track record of acting in barbaric, illegal, evil ways. And, as I said, sort of to your first question about the evolution of the Republican Party, the time's come for us to confront the reality. And I worked for a president who was the first envoy to China. I had a lot of questions and doubts back in the 80s that I raised, including with ambassadors to China. And I was always told that China's economic ascent would prove a constructive development to the United States, that they would become more respectful of of global rules-based order, as this administration likes to call it, and of human rights, and of their relationships as respectful, decent, honest partners with the rest of the developed world. That has turned out to be the singular greatest lie I think we've ever been told. We've dealt with the largest transfer of wealth now in the history of man, and the second largest economy in the world in China that has moved in the complete opposite direction as they've become more economically powerful because of our neglect, essentially. They have utilized those resources for manipulation of the global political structures, including multinational organizations like the World Health Organization is a perfect example. And they have expanded their military, expanded their South China Sea aggressions, now engaged in a global development plan that is extraordinarily threatening, I think, to the West and our interests. And importantly, while they've been routinely abusive of human rights all the way back to Mao, they're essentially engaged, not essentially, they are engaged in a genocidal treatment now of the Uyghurs, where millions of people are being, they're essentially trying to eradicate this ethnic group that they view as a threat wrongly.
Politicians and bureaucrats have engaged in wishful thinking back for an eternity. I mean, you can look at individual instances in our history, the tail end of the Vietnam War, where, the politicians and the bureaucrats were saying that we were going to be able to step out, and Kissinger was even preaching this, that we were going to be able to step out and the North Vietnamese were not going to move in, that they were just, going to make very limited incursions into certain border areas, but they were not going to come in and take Saigon. And that was ridiculous. Right. I mean, I did an interview with an author who wrote a book about that, and President Ford was getting such questionable advice from even his most high-level experts, I'm putting that in quotes because we're dealing with that whole expert issue now, telling him that that's what was going to happen at the tail end and that the country wasn't going to fall incredibly quickly. And he sent a close friend of his. He happened to be a photographer, a combat photographer that was a close friend of President Ford. He had to send him into South Vietnam to travel around the country, talk to people, and come back and report back to the president, because President Ford knew that the bureaucrats weren't giving him good advice. And all, 50, 60 some years that it's been since then, or 50 some, and we still have that problem where the people who are, have titles as experts, have training as experts, and they're not giving the straight information to the people and to the higher ups because they're all entrenched bureaucrats that have conflicting reasons for
and money.
To go
It's been corrupted.
And money. Yes.
It's essentially,
especially in the case of China.
Yeah, I mean, so you can have the greatest academic, professional level of expertise in any topical area. The problem is when you centralize those areas of expertise, you put them in positions where they become vulnerable to be corrupted by those who seek to influence the direction of thought in this country. And look at, you mentioned the Vietnam War. It's a perfect example. I mean, think back about the mockery of those who professed the anti-communist position at the time that the fall of Vietnam would lead to a domino theory. That was laughed at. It wasn't intellectually rebutted. It was scoffed at, that this was absurd. And they would joke that are the communists going to be in San Diego? That was kind of their joke. But then, look, Laos, Cambodia, I mean, the dominoes, in fact, fell. And the examples are abundant where the expert class in this country, and there's no better example than sinologists in China, have disturbed the public by really being routinely wrong. And they've been wrong in this pandemic as well. As the Fauci example clearly shows, it's an extraordinary disservice, and it's a dangerous one because we are at a tipping point right now where, absent corrective steps, the leadership of this country and even the sovereignty of this country is very much in jeopardy.
Well, and one of the reasons that it's more in jeopardy than it would be otherwise is because of what has happened with the press. They have always been biased, but they haven't always been full-on participants with one of the political parties. They're now the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party, with few exceptions. I mean, Fox is an exception, but even Fox is reluctant to go as far as they should, and the other ones outside of Fox, they don't have enough power. So it's basically the press is the propaganda arm of the Democrat Party, and so they're not speaking truth to power if the power is a Democrat.
I think what we really need to ultimately look at is, are they, yes, they are the propaganda outlets of the Democrat Party, but, is this whole thing a much deeper design than that? Because the Democrat Party also is much different today than it was decades ago. It no longer speaks for the working man and woman at all. It's the enemy of the working man and woman. It's the enemy of job creation. It's the enemy of higher wages. It's the enemy of economic independence and freedom. It's instead become the party of Davos, the party of this global design that has ill-served the country, our country. You have to sort of say, are these institutions not more predominantly corrupted by that agenda? It seems to me that's what's been happening. And the Democrat Party was actually the first institution to fall, followed very quickly by academia and media, which are completely in their hands. I mean, you literally have in academia right now a near monopoly of globalist, anti-American, anti-free market thinking that has, developed.
The way I refer to it on the podcast is I talk about the amplified voices in society, and the amplified voices in society in America are almost entirely on the left. You've got the media, you've got academia, you've got Hollywood, you've got bureaucrats that have a voice within the government. You've got Democrats in control to the extent they are at that particular moment. In this case, they're in control of the legislative and the executive branch, down to the point that conservative thought almost doesn't get expressed, and when it does, it gets attacked by the loudest amplified voices within society. With that in place, what do you think is going to happen in 2022 and 2024? Will the Republicans be able to overcome those problems, as well as, and I forgot to mention, the fact that big tech is 100% on board with the woke left? Are the Republicans going to be able to overcome that in 22 and 24? Note to the listeners, we've reached one of the points in the interview where there's going to be some discussion of the 2020 election, allegations of fraud, and the ongoing election audits in some states. One of the things you might notice is that my voice disappears into the background when both I and Michael Johns are talking at the same time. That's because of a problem I'm having with the soundboard. In light of the importance of the election issues, I want to make my stance clear, so I'm inserting this comment after the interview in light of the difficulty of dealing with the soundboard issue during the interview. I absolutely support the audits that are ongoing in states like Arizona. More of them need to be conducted. I share the suspicions many have that there were serious problems with the election. As I've expressed before, I'm also extremely frustrated that the Supreme Court essentially dodged their opportunity to address the substantive underlying issues in the lawsuit filed by Texas and 17 other states. As to my conclusion as to allegations of fraud sufficient to have changed the outcome of the election, I want to see the results of the audits and factor those results into the conclusion I reach. The more audits, the better. As to the legal changes and election processes that were put in place in the months approaching the date of the election, that's not an allegation of fraud. That's a legal argument that the election changes were impermissible or were put in place by individuals or bodies without the legal authority to do so. That's among the subjects that I am so disappointed the Supreme Court didn't address. In that respect, the court let the entire country down. Now back to the interview.
Well, the messaging and the alignment of issues certainly is favorable for us. I am still, as you can probably tell, focused on 2020, meaning in some ways the discussion of 2022, very important, very interesting candidates already beginning to emerge. And obviously our campaign process is now so lengthy that it is a present tense issue. But a lot of that rests on what I see as, the fact that we still have institutional resistance to thousands of affidavits, documents signed under risk of legal penalty if they were misrepresenting those facts that need to be taken seriously. And the messaging, obviously this administration is a colossal failure. I don't think you're hearing anyone even on their side coming out and speaking constructively about anything positive. No one can explain anything positive about happening in this border. All you can do is change the topic, pretend people aren't noticing that we don't have individuals in camouflage dodging across the border and just the videos are compelling.
Yeah, and
which is one of the reasons this administration doesn't want television coverage down at the border, and they've done everything they can to discourage it.
We either don't get coverage or we get a change in the language. So words don't mean what they used to mean. The whole infrastructure effort is hilarious. Everything is infrastructure. If I can think of it, it's infrastructure. Down to the point that only a tiny portion of the total, I think it was at 6% of this last multi-trillion-dollar budget proposal was actually for infrastructure, was actually going to roads, bridges, and transit terminals. Road bridges and airports was less than 6% of the total. And to my amazement, there's a dramatically larger amount proposed to be spent on mass transit facilities than on roads and bridges and any roadway infrastructure, even though that is used by many times more people than mass transit is. They almost want to. It almost seems like they want to abandon that. They want the use of
they do. They don't.
Less
this is a party that doesn't believe in automobile travel. I hate to. Yeah. It's not the future. It's not the vision they envision. And the problem is that their thinking is 1,000 miles ahead of any technology that's going to accommodate the American people. And this is very common in the way they've approached issues historically, where, the ideology is leading the practical reality. We don't have the infrastructure that's going to be able to replace the auto travel the American people properly rely on right now. nor do we have that in any immediate sight yet. To have policies that are being enacted that make it more and more difficult for individuals to travel by car is a conscious policy choice of theirs. And that's why you see the abandonment of domestic energy production. That's why you see gasoline prices on a massive ascent under their leadership. That's why you see the unwillingness to invest in that sort of infrastructure that is so essential. And there's just so many places where we have interstate highways, where we have major highways or areas of transportation, particularly suburban areas in this country where commutes have become just utterly unbearable for a lot of people and really require adjustment and expansion to roads that haven't been adjusted or expanded in decades. There's none of that in any of this spending. I don't even call it. It's they can call it infrastructure all day long. It's nothing to do with infrastructure. What they're doing. This is a major, vast giveaway to their political constituents.
Going back two things. Going back 25, close to 30 years ago. I live in South Florida, which is very much Broward County, which is very much a Democrat county. I've seen presentations from government consultants between 25 and 30 years ago, basically saying that they deliberately want to reduce, they don't want to improve the favorability, the circumstances of a commute. They deliberately want to make the roadways inconvenient for commuting so that they can force people onto mass transit. It is a plan. It's not a bug.
De Blasio in New York City is a great example of that. I mean, de Blasio's policies have been designed, to really increase the burden on individuals involved in these drives.
The second thing is that Democrats actually want to force people back into large municipalities. They want city urban voters because once people live in cities, they are more likely to be more dependent on government. They are more likely to vote Democrat. So the long-term plan is to undermine the suburbs, push people back to an urban core, and promote the Democrat Party as a result.
Well, I mean, realize we have three, sort of areas of geographic and demographic residents. We have people who live in urban environments, people who are in suburban environments, and then rural voters are really the ones getting the big squeeze, and a large percentage of Americans are in rural areas. I think they consider that maybe their design, but they have not made the American city a very appealing place to live. They've governed these cities in most cases for decades. These cities have become very unmanaged and inhospitable. Bad school systems, drug and crime problems, now street violence that they've literally permitted and refused, to allow their law enforcement to properly police. They're undermining law enforcement in these cities, which is making the criminal statistics even worse. And it's a shame because it's very difficult. I've said it's very difficult to envision having a great country without having great cities.
Yep.
But our cities have been in pretty steady decline for the most part, with a few exceptions, for decades now.
Take a big subject matter jump, and go into a different direction. You were involved in the very early years of the Tea Party. In fact, I think, would it be accurate to say you were involved in the formation, or just?
Yes.
All right, in the formation of the Tea Party. What commonalities do you see between the Tea Party movement and what you could call the Trump movement, the populist move of the Republican Party? And are Trump supporters and Tea Party supporters the same people?
Yeah, the only real distinction has been the passage of time. So the issues that we confronted in 2009 versus the ones we're confronting today. Remember, in 2009, we'd had the bank bailout, the housing crisis, the vast expansion of government into healthcare, and all of the associated problems that were attached to that. Today, those three issues I mentioned of China trade and immigration are, even more profound. But importantly, when we founded the Tea Party movement in 2009, what it accomplished essentially was bringing people, millions, tens of millions ultimately, into the political fold who had not had an avenue for political engagement. And unknown to many, because this question always gets presented, is, what is Trump's view of the Tea Party movement? Trump spoke at one of our Tea Party rallies down in your area, in fact, in Boca Raton, and 2011, still on YouTube. It's a speech definitely worth watching, because you can see how he properly integrates both the Tea Party messaging with the Make America Great Again agenda. Now, I endorsed President Trump on day one. Many of my fellow co-founders, because we had really a major role in electing several of the 2016 presidential candidates, getting them into politics. In fact, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, had a different outlook on it. But I really think with the passage of time, everybody's pretty much on board at this point that the Trump presidency was trying to move the country in the right direction.
I agree.
And against great odds, and that we've got to confront those odds.
I know you've said you're focused on 2020, but I have to ask, will Trump run in 2024?
He doesn't know the answer to that question. So no one else does.
What if he does, and what if he doesn't?
If he does, he will be the logical nominee, I believe. I think
he'd be very 100% on that.
Yeah, what if, and particularly if he comes forward, which this isn't always his instinct, but if he comes forward and says, here's a few things we missed in my first shot at this, I think that particularly will just the base of support and the enthusiasm for his candidacy would be, and it's just going to be very high. Now, if he doesn't, then you can't discount the fact that whoever he endorses, if he does endorse anyone in the primary, which he might not, would be a great beneficiary of that endorsement. But I can't envision, there's really not even a debate today in this Republican Party, except inside the Beltway and in, kind of elite media, where they attempt to sort of say that, Trump's a fringe figure, or that there's some alternative vision for this country. When you look at these never Trumpers, many of whom I've worked with, many of whom I know, the logic all ultimately just boils down to the fact that they don't like him on some personal level. The policies that he's supported, I think, are just, indisputably necessary.
I think that President Trump has transformed the Republican Party into the party of the working class. And I think a fair number of these never Trumpers don't like that. They don't want to be the party of the working class. They don't want to be the party of ordinary Americans.
It might be that. I think that's part of it. I think also they maybe didn't feel a part of it. It wasn't their idea, so it can't be a good idea.
Yeah.
And we've confronted this from a lot of, and I try to look at it, fairly, but I just sort of say, my entire career, I've been pushing to get this recognition that our party is best positioned to represent working men and women, the blue collar working population of this country. And I think we do at this point need to recognize that the party's composition is transforming rapidly. We are a multi-ethnic party whose base of support is among individual working Americans with a great degree of commitment and interest in seeing this country's and their communities succeed, and are skeptical of all of these globalist designs that have ill-served them over the years.
One final question. So you and I absolutely agree if Trump runs, he will win the nomination. If he doesn't run, is there a circumstance, is there a candidate who might actually have a better chance of winning the general than President Trump? And as I ask that, I recognize we're too far out to be talking about that, but this is sort of It's sort of the way podcasts are. The internet is.
Yeah, this is a
speculate.
topic of this is the sort of topic that is of most interest to I guess what you would call the political class, is to think in terms of individuals. And my guidance is always, don't think in terms of the candidates, think in terms of the movement. That you build the movement, the candidates come to the movement. The movement doesn't go to the candidate, and that'll maybe be no more true in 2024 if Trump doesn't run. Whatever candidate emerges out of that is going to prevail because they win over the hearts and minds of the movement. And that's the bottom line. That's the headline. The headline right now is it's about the people. It's about the movement. That movement has its origins in the Tea Party movement for sure. And it's evolving as it always must evolve to address the challenges and issues that we're confronting in the present tense. We can't run 21st century messaging and campaigns on 20th century challenges and problems.
You and I are in complete agreement on that. If Trump does not run, whoever does get the Republican nomination, if they are seen as abandoning the populist movement, the representation of the working class, that was sort of the highlight, the core of Trumpism, so to speak. If they're seen as abandoning that, there is no way they will win the general election, even if they manage to win the nomination. But if they are seen as a strong supporter of it, and hopefully if they get the support of President Trump, then I think they've got whoever it is, and I have my personal favorite if Trump doesn't run in it.
I think his voter integrity is huge. I don't think we had a free and fair election in 2020, to say the least. If we're going to go into 2024 with the same operating processes that allowed those incidents to occur, you're not going to have a free and fair election again in this country until you resolve those issues. And I'm seeing a little bit of progress in some areas, but not enough, not nearly enough, that suggests to me that we're taking this seriously enough. And those individuals and institutions that have been supported to defend our Constitution, and talking about billions of dollars that have gone into these institutions over the years, have not risen to this moment of crisis. We're not even. I don't even believe the Republican National Committee has risen to this moment of crisis. I haven't heard from them any affirmation of the validity of the Navarro report, or the Texas Attorney General's filing with the Supreme Court, or President Trump's allegation that the outcome of the election was inaccurate. Why not? I mean, if they disagree with that, then we need to see their report and their details. Otherwise, they need to get in line and support this. But for them to sort of stand on the sidelines when the organization that's charged with the management really of this, when the Department of Justice ultimately is the institution that should be dealing with it and isn't. They haven't investigated. They haven't even interviewed most of these whistleblowers that have emerged to speak of these, and those who have been questioned mostly about how they ended up going public with their allegations. So it doesn't appear to me that we have any serious federal investigation going on. So it falls to the party, and the party's just incredibly been allowed to be. I say allowed to be because we need to take responsibility for these issues. This is not an issue of simply blaming institutions. These institutions are institutions we created. They're institutions we ultimately determine who and how they're governed. And we need to be demanding that the Republican Party come out with an affirmation right now of their assessment of what transpired in these 6 states. They are the ones who should have been putting together the Navarro report. Peter Navarro did so as a great patriot, but it shouldn't have been falling to a trade advisor to the President of the United States to do that. He did a great job. He's a Harvard PhD and bright guy, so his intellectual and academic credentials to do what he did are unmatched. But the institution that got $1.4 billion in this election cycle not only didn't protect the election from fraud, hasn't, more importantly, risen after this fraud to detail and challenge it.
Well, one comment I'll make on the election issues, it doesn't help the Democratic Party that so many of them are trying to stop the audits that are occurring in multiple states. It really makes it look like they are trying to cover something up. And
well, it does to those of us who are following it. You have to realize that, there's varying degrees of political engagement in this country, and you already have a great degree of cynicism. I think your typical American might respond by saying, well, of course they're trying to cover it up. That's what they do. It's what they've always done. That, of course, is not acceptable. And it's why those of us who are politically engaged need to change it. And this is important temperamentally, because you can't develop and sustain a constitutional republic and a representative democracy when a majority of the country believes those are just labels in name only.
So, setting aside the actions, statements, lack thereof of the Republican Party, what about their elected legislators? Let's take Georgia, for example. They have passed an election integrity bill, and there are a couple of other ones out there. Texas failed because the Democrats walked off the floor, but they're calling a special session back. The governor's going to force the issue. What about these election integrity bills? Have they gone far enough? In your view, do they reinstate sufficient safeguards in the election process?
No, they haven't gone far enough. Many states haven't done anything. And, the changes we need are, number one, individuals who are registered to vote, or when they go to register to vote, should be issued a voter identification card. That to me is, by the way, there's a little nuance that I came up with that I'll take some credit for, of coming up with more recently. I thought through this issue and I said, if I go to New York City and things like, well, it is true, there are individuals who don't drive there. They take Uber or cabs. I think that's a trend that's likely to continue. This idea of individuals who, don't have ID, let's sort of just concede that to the Democrats. All right. Because that's really their only argument against it. They have no other credible argument. Their argument is, well, you're disenfranchising a certain percentage of the voter base. Let's concede that. I think the position has to be, for a very reasonable cost, certainly much less than imposed on all of these states in dealing with the follow-up regarding the irregularities and fraud allegations. You could issue, a voter identification card, probably photo ID with the when the person registers, much like you would with a driver's license. That solves a lot of issues right there. Number two, you've got to purge these voter rolls. So this is another area where Democrats are resisting it. So you take somebody like me, not uncommon. I've probably lived in half a dozen or more states. I've been registered to vote in all those states, voted in all those states. I'm probably still registered in all of those states. They're not purging these voter rolls to remove people who have either relocated or have died and are not eligible to be voting in the present tense. And that also, there's no logical argument not to do that, except that you're consciously inviting engagement of fraudulent actors.
Especially when you combine it with mass mailing of absentee ballots as opposed to mailing.
But we should never have absentee ballot. I mean, this should sometimes look simple. Simple is sometimes better. And, I think we've gotten ahead of ourselves in a lot of technical ways that have not, both in the commercial sense and in the public sense, well served the American people. And, the customer service in this country has deteriorated while the technology has increased. In the private sector, and I would say in the public sector, the reliability has diminished as well. We need individuals show up at their polling location with their voter ID and cast their written ballot. We don't need systems. Those are unnecessary. They're also prone to manipulation, fraud, and error, and they make it very difficult to conduct post-election audits if they're necessary, and to cast their ballot that way. And we have one day of voting, not weeks, with a mechanism for individuals who are not going to be available to vote that day to provide an absentee ballot.
Especially the military, you have to have the system, the absentee system at a minimum.
Well, right, and and they need to be counted, and they need to be actively, aware of what the approach is for voting. A lot of anecdotal cases in this past cycle where they either weren't offered that, weren't made aware of how to go about doing it. That needs to be done. And nobody's trying to disenfranchise anyone here. We're making this system reliable and dependent so that the American people can feel confident that the person declared the winner is the actual winner. And we're making it difficult, if not impossible, for those who have malicious and fraudulent intent in manipulating our democratic processes to be unable to do that.
Yeah, I absolutely think we need to improve election security. I think, for example, that any ballots received after the date of the election should not be counted. But that's a state-by-state issue, which is one of the reasons it's so difficult to get it all changed. We're only going to be able to get progress as it stands right now in red states, where we have a majority in the legislature and a governor that's a Republican that hopefully will not veto. But most of the states that are involved here, that's what we have in most of the swing states, but not all. Some of them have Democrat governors who would veto. So that creates an uphill climb. One final comment or question before we close. I just want to ask you, do you have anything more you'd like to promote, and would you like to tell people how they can find your commentary, any websites, et cetera?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter with my name as one word, Michael Johns, MichaelJohns. I'm on Facebook. Michael Johns Tea Party is my Facebook page, and YouTube. My name, one word, Michael Johns. I'm also on all the emerging conservative-friendly sites, usually under my name, one word, Michael Johns.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
I always enjoy an engaging interview, and that was certainly one of them. Remember, I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. Be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.